This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research, and in this case, stories. Our guest this week is one of Israel's best-known novelists, Assaf Gavron. He has written 6 novels, 8 books altogether, some non-fiction, short stories and essays as well. His work has been translated into 12 languages. He also has a band and established Israel's writers and poets soccer team. But we're not going to talk about soccer today. We'll be talking about his latest book that was translated into English. It's called The Hilltop. It was published in 2014 by a Scribner. Assaf Gavron, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi. Thank you.
So the heroes of your book are 2 brothers, Ronnie and Gabi, 2 former kibbutznikim who end up living in an illegal outpost in the West Bank. For Gabi, who discovered religion after a life strewn with tragedies, it was both a personal and an ideological choice. For his brother, having recently sustained a personal crisis, and we won't say more, no spoilers here, it was because he had really nowhere else to go, ended up living with his brother. Now, this book, the core of the book, is a very personal story about these 2 brothers, but it is set in one of the most politicized scenes imaginable. So why did you set it in a settlement if the story itself is very personal?
I think all stories are eventually personal. Or all novels, even if they deal with big issues or political questions or the subjects that are considered big and wide in scope, I think you want to know to get into the story through people, through personal lives. For me, as a writer who is interested in the Israeli condition, if you want, the conflict, the wars and so on, I will not be interested in writing a political book explaining, the different sides or the different views and, the big political ideologies and so on. I want to tell and to learn the story through personal lives.
But what was it that drew secular Tel Avivian novelists such as yourself to focus on the settlement? Which was foreign land for you, wasn't it? You spent a long time living there, immersing yourself in life in the West Bank among these people. It was a great deal of discovery for you too.
It was. What made me want to write about it, I think for me it's an easy answer and it's pretty obvious. It is foreign, but it affects me. It affects the lives of everyone in Israel, every Israeli. The question of settlements for me was fascinating on many levels. One is what I said now, the fact that what they do, although it's a small number of people and a small portion of land, affects Israelis all over the country and beyond. And the status of Israel, the image of Israel, of me as an Israeli and so on. Another thing is the actual story, the passion of the settlers, their way of life. They're kind of dealing in a kind of a no man's land, a territory which is, it's very complicated to explain, but to put it in a few words, it's in an unclear legal status following the war and the occupation and so on. And actually there are about 4 or 5 different legal systems applying to that area. And the way the settlers kind of use, I think, very smart techniques and ideas and ideologies and contacts to prosper and to go on and to succeed in staying despite the different legal problems and pressures, for me was very fascinating. And that's another aspect of the book, the legal drama and the way they kind of managed to find the way.
Yeah, it's very interesting in the plot. A lot of times what happens with this Hilltop is based on a sort of random series of declarations and policies and laws, and maybe they're going to evacuate them, maybe not. Somebody picks up the phone, talks to the minister or the assistant minister. It's almost like between the settlers and the ministers, there's not a whole country to run, but like a little private world of this Hilltop and the people who are supposed to be running Israel. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always tell about this book that one of the main characters is bureaucracy, and it doesn't sound so appealing, for people who may want to buy a novel, even a novel about Israel, that the main character is a bureaucracy. But I think that actually it's a fascinating main character, and also absurd in many ways and funny. But this very complicated way, which is hard to explain in a few sentences, I guess you need a whole novel for that, of how they, as you say, they know someone from the army and they make a phone call and this guy knows another guy, and then they get some kind of permission to pave a road to the outpost, for example. And then there is a road, so another authority needs to put a rail in order to protect the cars from falling to the wadi. So they put the rail and then they make another phone call, and then someone wakes up in America and says, hey, what's going on? And then they'll put pressure down on that minister, and the pressure will come down to the settlers, and they'll make another phone call, and then something else will turn their attention to another area, and there's violence, and there's a million things and different pressure groups. For me, it was a fascinating world to try to explore and understand.
The story itself, then your narration is very straightforward, and the characters are really very human. It's all very down to earth. I mean, the book is, not overly dramatic in any way. It's not idealizing the settlers or demonizing them. I mean, it seems almost like there's really no political undertone to this whole story. Were you conscious of that? Did you try not to buy into the debate that's really most of what we hear in the media today of settlements and the sympathizers, pushing for one agenda and their detractors pushing for another agenda?
I think I could sum up Gilad's question. Did you have a message?
No, I think for sure this wasn't purpose. To answer your question, I think there is a message, but the message is not political. I think that for me, a novel is not a way to convey a political ideology or to make a political stance. I have other outlets for that. I have an opinion and I don't hide it. And for example, we talked about it before. I published an essay in a book commemorating the 50 years for occupation.
Yeah, the Kingdom of Olives and Ash.
Yeah, and but that's an essay. That's non-fiction. For me, fiction does not need to go into those areas, and it was not my purpose intentionally to demonize or to praise the settlers.
Sure, but what about the unconscious? I mean, it's something that, because you're Israeli, you have your own opinions. Were you overly conscious of how what you say about them could be interpreted?
Yes, very much so. I mean, when I was just starting the book, was thinking about it and talking to friends, my good friends told me, don't go there.
Why not?
Don't walk into this minefield. Because you're bound to anger people and to be misinterpreted and misunderstood. And it's so sensitive, and this one will say this and this one will say that. Actually, in retrospect, I can say that all in all, I think at least I'm happy with the reactions on both sides, because there would be those on both sides who would not even open the book. So on the right, they will say, oh, it's a lefty writer from Tel Aviv, and we're not interested in what he has to say. Or maybe they would open it and look for errors and mistakes, and there were some people, there were some, tweets about using wrong words or something like that, or terms. And then on the left, there would be those who say, I'm not interested in reading about the settlers. I don't want to know anything about them, especially that apparently, as you say, it's non-biased. It's not demonizing them. It shows them as human beings. So I think those two extremes are kind of out of the game. But going more into centrally, but still on both sides, there were a lot of warm reactions. I think the one example that shows it is that the book won a prize called the Bernstein Prize. It's one of the top 3 literary prizes in Israel. And on the committee were 2 literature professors from Haifa and Tel Aviv, who are, your kind of standard literature professor you would expect, lefty and liberal and so on. But the third one was a professor from Bar Ilan, who's a very extreme right-wing, Hillel Weiss, also professor of literature, but very political and very known for his really ultra-extreme right-wing views. He's a settler as well. And the 3 of them got together and decided to give this literary prize to this book. So I think, for me, that's a sign that I achieved this kind of balance. Again, not that I think that there should be a political balance, but in terms of writing a novel, I didn't want it to be a political statement.
Let's talk about how you got to know those characters so well. You spent time living in a settlement. That must have been an experience that changed some of your thinking. What did you learn from that time that you lived there that you didn't know before? Were there stereotypes that were broken down? And I have to ask, why did they accept you living there?
Okay, so I learned a lot, but I don't think that I changed my views much. I'll start with the last question about them accepting me there. Actually, that also answers the first part of the question, because the answer to both is that the West Bank is very diverse. There are all kinds of settlers, of settlements. Within a settlement, there could be all kinds of people, different motives for living there. There is, of course, the ideological known one, the religious one, but there's also reasons of quality of life, and there's beautiful nature there, and kind of almost as strange as it may sound, almost a hippie kind of way of life in nature. So this diversity for me was the big surprise, was the main thing I think I learned. And I moved around and I traveled around and I met those different diverse characters. And the diversity was also in the acceptance of me. There were places, I'll just say, explain crudely that the West Bank is made up of Judea, which is the south of Jerusalem, and Samaria, which is north of Jerusalem. By and large, Samaria is more extreme political, ideological, except for one place in Judea, which is the city of Hebron and around it. But basically, the north of Samaria, around the Palestinian cities of Nablus and Jenin, is where the most extreme settlements are and the most ideological settlers. So when I went there, they would sometimes come and ask me what I was doing there. And I always said who I was and what I was doing. I remember once there was this freezing of settlements that Obama, I think, in his first year, managed to put pressure on the Israeli government to freeze the settlements. And I went into this...
freeze the construction, just so our listeners understand.
Yeah,
Stop construction for a while,
Yeah. And it stopped for almost a year, a little under a year. And during this time, it was the time of my research, and I went into this outpost, and I see this kind of factory, and they're working on something. And it was these bases for trailers, which are obviously meant to be made for settling. And it was an obvious proof that there's no freezing at all. And I went there and I looked around and he asked who I was, and I said, and then he made a phone call, and then he put down the phone and he said, go away. And actually he said it in less pleasant words. But on the other hand, of this diversity, as I said, Judea, south of Jerusalem, is more moderate. And I did find this one place which I ended up going back to again and again, which is called Koa. It's a settlement really about 15-minute drive from south of Jerusalem. From its beginning, has been built as a more moderate place. The ratio of seculars and religious, for example, started as 50-50. Now it's about 70% religious, which is still a lot of seculars relative to settlements. And especially this outpost, which became the inspiration for the outpost in the book, people just, were nice to me. Almost proud that a lefty from Tel Aviv wanted to learn about them, to know about them. Didn't come with an agenda or shouting or as part of a protest or something like that. So there I found a welcoming attitude, and that's where I went.
Tell us a bit about the two main characters, especially Gabi, whose life story is very unique, yet I feel like I know the type. I mean, someone who started off as a kibbutznik, who was outcast in his childhood, sustained few terrible personal tragedies, then discovered God and became this ideological settler. Yet his ideological devotion to God and to the political project is somewhat ambiguous, I think. Am I wrong? Tell us about him.
I don't think you're wrong. I'll start by saying that you don't structure your characters as symbols necessarily. But having said that, Gabi and Ronnie, I think both represent very much Israeli types.
I feel like I know them as archetypes in a way, but unique characters, but I know the type.
Yeah, and very different. They are brothers, and they're both very Israeli types, but very different Israeli types. And in contradiction to Ronnie, who is this macho Israeli who has a lot of success in everything he does to begin with, and he's very confident, until he doesn't, because this success always feels like it's kind of on
tenuous.
The border. But he's always very confident about what he's doing and has success with that for a while. Whereas Gabi, this more kind of almost lost soul, kind of waiting for life to lead him instead of grabbing life and leading himself to places. And he starts in the kibbutz, as you say, they both do, but he always feels like he's a little bit outside. They're also, you kind of hinted on that, they're orphans. So for him, it's probably from the get-go, it's a weakening kind of element in his life. And he tries and he sees the success of his brother in everything, in work, in the kibbutz and in the army and with women and everything, in business later. But he's more of a follower. And he's kind of, torn between different forces that pull him into different places. But under the surface, which is very kind of introvert and shy and quiet, there is something waiting to burst. And it does burst from time to time. And again, for me, it does show the Israeliness, in a sense, some violence always bubbling under the surface, even when many times it's over the surface and outside. But a lot of times when it's contained, it could still somehow burst. And then this tendency of him to be pulled and influenced by other forces eventually leads him to religion and to the West Bank as a settler.
I would say that internal force is actually quite a dark side for Gabi. It's not just, it leads him to a certain bubbling violence, but it's a really dark streak in his soul in a way. And it goes along with what you said, that he seems a little bit lost. And there are a few characters in the Hilltop settlement who are quirky and a little bit idiosyncratic and maybe even a little bit lost. And I almost wondered if you can look at this settlement in particular, maybe as a symbol, maybe not, as somewhat of a collection of people who are a little bit lost, not just, completely ideologically, Zionistically, messianic, but also just people who are kind of searching for, like you said, a bit of a hippie getaway. Was there something of that you saw?
That's part of what I feel is really the anti-idealization of the settlers. They all have their quirks and foibles, and we all look down on them in one way or another.
So I've been getting this since the book was published from different people, and the settlers themselves or right-wing people said it as a complaint. Oh, it's just a bunch of weirdos. It's not like that in reality. But I must say that I never planned it that way. And for me, there are people, I think every human being
is a bunch of misfits.
Is a little bit of a misfit and confused and a bit of an outsider. I didn't mean structure this settlement as a collection of weirdos or misfits in order to show that all settlers are like that. And I think there are those who are very clear, they're very confident actually in their way of life. But I think that for me it's humanity. It's not something different from other collections of people.
Let me ask you about that, because there's a close, it's, in a way you're saying it's what I saw. These are the people that I met. And in many aspects of the book, there are very close takeoffs on reality, including some of the names that you use for characters in the book. Like, I think the best example is your American patron of the settlement, Mammelstein, who sounds an awful lot like Sheldon Adelson. I mean, some of the, and you know, the Minister of Education reminds me very much of our Minister of Education. There are certain things that are so close to reality that I wonder, on an artistic level, does that help you make them into caricatures, or could it be almost too much of a, is there an artistic danger in being so close to, you know, what's actually happening on the ground?
I think there is a danger, but the fun is to tackle each case individually. I think actually the education minister, at the time of writing, he was not,
it's not the education.
So maybe it foresaw him.
It's an archetype.
No, but the character I can talk about is the defense minister, which is very much Ehud Barak I had in mind, which I'm not even sure he was, you know, in periods in his life, defense minister, and something about his this kind of, on the one hand, confidence that he shows on the outside, and very kind of impulsive character, but then, you know, he's lamenting the loss of his dog at some point and thinking about his dog. And again, this is, I don't know if Ehud Barak had a dog and he was sad about losing him. So you always...
I don't think Ehud Barak was sad about anything, ever.
Maybe when he lost Prime Minister.
Well, not even.
Yeah. So you always take off from reality. But this was a case that I had someone in mind, that I could see him. Of course, the scenes were all invented. The dialogue was all invented. But there was something about him that I could see, and perhaps readers could also. But I think in most other cases, you know, you use a kind of a overriding archetype in a way. Mammelstein could be Adelson also, although also Adelson was not so prominent when I was writing the book. I had this idea of an American benefactor. I mean, there are plenty. There were before Adelson and there will be after.
Who are called Sheldon. Yeah.
And who are called Sheldon also. So to answer your question, if you go around and you use reality and you maybe divert a little bit but of the names or of the behaviors, but you want people to understand, then for me it's not really a novel, it's a parody. And I did not want to do that. Mm-hmm. But I did enjoy playing with the fact that this book of fiction is actually based on a very real reality. And we talked before about the bureaucracy and the way the settlers operate. I did want it to be realistic. I did want it to sound realistic. So you do walk on this thin line between reality and fiction.
But you say you didn't want it to be a parody, but there is, in many parts of the book, a sort of almost satirical tone to it. Did you do that on purpose, or it just came out that way? Did you even notice it, or is it just me?
No, I think that's the way I write. I wrote other books, some more about the political situation in Israel. For example, Almost Dead, which was also published in the US, is about the period of suicide bombings. I think that even when I tackle this serious subject, and tragic and sad subject, and also when I write about other things, my style of writing will always be, in a way, you know, I will always use humor and fun. I'll enjoy, when I write, I want to entertain my readers more than I want to, you know, be known as this great literary writer. I wouldn't mind that either. And I enjoy, you know, reading reviews that talk about the literary merits of the books and getting prizes for that. But for me, I like to entertain when I write, and when I read also, I like to smile and to be entertained. So I think that's simply the way I write. But I agree with you that there are satirical, you know, parts to the book or aspects of the book because this situation invites it. Some of it is absurd, and there are funny moments in this mayhem and this balagan, this mess. But what I meant before is that it's not a one-on-one, straightforward description of reality with the little changes. That would be a total parody, and that's what I didn't want to do.
Tell us a bit about the different reactions in Israel and in the world to the book. Because at the end of the day, as we said before, this is like a very Israeli story. I mean, part of its strength, I think, to me at least as an Israeli, is, as we said, feeling like we all know the archetypes, these people, we've come across them at some point. Do you feel that people who read you in the world, in the US and elsewhere, fundamentally understand what you want to say, the nuances of the story?
Not in the same way, mostly. There would always be an advantage to an Israeli, I think, in the depth of understanding and in the level of knowing the story and understanding little references. And sometimes in the translation, you asked before if there were changes. So there were not major changes, but sometimes with a small matter that in Hebrew, you use two words to explain something that behind them there is a whole world that an Israeli will understand by reading those two words. In translation, you would choose not to go into explaining. Those two words will not mean anything, and you don't want to explain with a book, with a footnote, or start opening the subject. It's not worth it. So there would be things in the book, stories or issues covered that an Israeli reader would have an advantage. But at the same time, I mean, the success of the book abroad, and it was translated to 9 languages, I think. I mean, from the United States to, it's coming out now in the Czech Republic.
All of our Czech listeners, listen up. The book is about to be published.
Yeah. Do you know what the title in Czech is?
No.
Actually, that is an unfair question.
No, it's something. They actually, recently, they emailed me about it. It's not straight the Hilltop, it's the Hilltop of something on the Hilltop, or I don't remember. Okay. It's related, but not
it wasn't
straight.
a serious question.
The translation question, I think, is very interesting because so much of the book is written in very Israeli, idiomatic vernacular. It's not just that there are references, it's that it's a whole style of interacting and speaking. Especially, I think it's the opening chapter that is written in a sort of faux biblical lilt, you know, and language. Did they try in English at least to make an effort to recreate that?
Well, actually, the Bible is an example to the contrary, I think, because everyone has the Bible in their language, and I know English, but I assume that in every language it has this kind of special language that the translator of this chapter would try to kind of adapt to that. And again, I think what you need in order to appeal to foreign readers, and that speaks to all books in all languages, a Czech writer, when translated to Hebrew, it would also apply to him, is that there is enough of a story that is not only an inside story for that culture or that language.
Or if it is, that it becomes universal. I'm thinking of Milan Kundera, whose novels have become so universal, even though many of them are set very much in Czech situations.
Yeah, exactly. So if the story is about human beings, everything that we said before about Gabi and Roni, and we won't repeat it, but it's not a unique Israeli... we did say that it's an Israeli archetype, but it's not a unique Israeli characteristic to be an introvert or a kind of a macho, confident guy. So I think that there's enough in the stories and in the characters, together with giving people from the outside of Israel and understanding on this very unique settlement story, that they hear about it, they read about it in the news, but they actually don't know what it means in day-to-day life. So I think the combination appeals to foreign readers as well, even if they don't read it in the exact same way.
All right, Assaf Gavron, novelist, whose latest, 6th novel was translated into English, The Hilltop, which is what we've been discussing now. Thank you very much for coming on the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our archive. There are more than 350 interviews to keep you busy and entertained and perhaps annoyed as well.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Like us on Facebook. Our name is the Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.